In this video, we're talking about how retirement planning fundamentally shifts once you cross $2.5 million in savings and why optimization replaces accumulation as your primary financial focus. Through working with high net worth clients who reach this wealth threshold, I've noticed that the strategies, the priorities, and the psychological approach that built wealth, they become completely different from the strategies needed to preserve and to deploy it efficiently. And so that's exactly why we're making this video today, to show you the critical shifts that occur at $2.5 million and how successful wealth holders adapt their planning to this new financial reality. So let's get right into it. Once you cross about $2.5 million in savings, retirement planning changes. And I don't just mean that the numbers get bigger. I mean the entire framework of how you make decisions shifts. Now, before I go any further, I want to say this clearly. I'm being a little general by using $2.5 million as the line in the sand, because your lifestyle, your spending needs, where you live, your healthcare costs, all of that plays a role. So for some people, this shift happens a little bit above that number, and for some, maybe a little bit below that number. But $2.5 million is a really common point where the pattern starts to change for a lot of households. So we're going to use that as an anchor today. Because at this level, with proper planning, the fear of running out of money, it becomes dramatically less likely. You've built enough that mathematically the portfolio can support you. And so the question stops being, will I have enough? And it starts becoming, how do I optimize what I already have? And that's a very different skill set. Most people don't realize this. They keep using the same accumulation mindset that helped them to build their wealth long after they've reached the point where optimization matters far more than growth. Because once you cross that $2.5 million mark, the priorities, they flip. Instead of squeezing every last bit of return out of a portfolio, you're now focused on shrinking your lifetime taxes, controlling your future RMDs, strategically using Roth conversions, protecting the surviving spouse, and then thinking, often maybe for the first time, about intentional legacy and wealth transfer. And there's also a psychological shift that happens here. So for 30 or 40 years, your job was to build and to accumulate and to grow. But once you reach this threshold, the real challenge becomes deploying wealth efficiently without creating unnecessary tax drag, unnecessary risk, or unnecessary complexity. And that's why this $2.5 million number becomes a true inflection point. Because at this level, even conservative withdrawal rates typically generate $100,000 or more in sustainable annual income, and that's before Social Security. And so when your basic lifestyle needs are covered, it gives you something incredibly valuable, and that is choice. Choice to structure your income tax differently, choice to decide how and when to use Roth conversions, choice to set up trusts or gifting strategies, choice to design your legacy intentionally rather than accidentally. And it's also right around this point where multi-generational wealth considerations and more advanced strategies suddenly become relevant, sometimes even necessary. So instead of small adjustments, crossing the $2.5 million threshold typically requires a more intentional shift in your strategy, not just minor tweaks. So this threshold creates new priorities. But let's look at how there's also a tax burden shift that shows us that there's also a big planning change. So once you are operating at or above that $2.5 million level, one of the first things that surprises people is this. Taxes, not lifestyle spending, often become your single largest annual expense. And I know it sounds dramatic, but let me walk you through what actually happens. For many retirees with substantial portfolios, annual tax bills routinely land in the $50,000 to $100,000 plus range, not because they're overspending, but because the tax system treats accumulated wealth very differently once your accounts get large. And a big part of that is RMDs, right? Large traditional IRA balances create forced distributions that can easily exceed your basic spending needs. And it's not unusual for a couple with a few $1 million in pre-tax accounts to be required to take out more income than they actually want to spend. And all of that is taxable. And then you add into that dividends, interest, capital gains, and the portion of Social Security that becomes taxable once your income rises. And on top of that, you've got Medicare surcharges, IRMA penalties, which can add to several $1,000s per person per year. And when you put all that together, the tax bill becomes bigger than most of the other line items in your budget, bigger than travel, bigger than healthcare, bigger than home maintenance. And in many cases, it's the largest annual cost of retirement. And that is the shift that most people don't see coming, because at this level, the question stops being, how do I grow my money faster? And it becomes, well, how do I keep more of what I already have? And that's where tax planning becomes far more powerful than chasing returns. A 2% improvement in after-tax efficiency often does more for your long-term outcomes than trying to squeeze an extra 2% out of the market. One is controllable and the other one is completely unpredictable. And when you start modeling this out over a 20 or 30-year retirement, it's not unusual to see $500,000 or more in lifetime savings simply because we're managing withdrawals, conversions, and your income timing is more strategic. And at this stage, the biggest improvements, they don't come from picking better investments. They come from coordinating your tax, your withdrawal, Social Security, and your Medicare decisions like an actual system. And because of that, this level of planning, it typically requires advisors who specialize in tax strategy, not just investment management, because that's where the majority of the value is going to be created going forward. Taxes take over, but the real turning point is when growth stops being the goal and control takes its place. So once you cross that $2.5 million mark, or whatever that number is for you in your lifestyle, something interesting happens. Your planning priorities shift away from maximizing returns and then more towards maximizing your control. Because at this point, you've already achieved the accumulation goal. You've built the wealth. Now the job is to deploy it efficiently, minimize the drag, and make sure that it lasts on your terms. And that's why strategies like, I know you're tired of hearing about it, but Roth conversions, they often become far more powerful than trying to chase the next market-beating investment. It's not about swinging for the fences. It's about repositioning your money so that your future tax obligations shrink instead of grow. And this is also where things like capital gains harvesting and tax loss strategies, they start to deliver real value, not because they dramatically change your return, but because they improve how much of that return you actually keep. And withdrawal sequencing becomes just as important. Which account should you take from first? When do you tap taxable assets versus pre-tax versus Roth? Those decisions, the order, the timing, the coordination, it often matters more than the allocation itself. Because here's the truth. Once you're operating at this level, control strategies, they typically increase your after-tax wealth more than continually focusing on accumulation ever could. And that leads us to an important question. Why does control become more valuable than growth once substantial wealth is in place? Well, for one, strategic tax planning can save 20 to 30% of your portfolio over the course of retirement. That's not theoretical, right? We've modeled that out every year for clients who take advantage of their planning window. Controlling volatility, controlling distributions, it also creates a level of security that pure growth strategies can't match. You're smoothing income, you're minimizing surprises, and you're building predictability into your retirement lifestyle. And maybe most importantly, this shift enables confident spending. So instead of continuing the accumulation mindset, the just keep saving, just keep growing mentality, you're finally able to enjoy the wealth that you've built without second guessing and anxiety. In fact, the retirees who make the transition the best, they tend to actually use their wealth. They travel more, they give more, they live more intentionally because they're no longer hoarding out of habit. They're in control, their plan is in control, and that control is what provides them with that sense of freedom. So now that you've seen how these strategic shifts work, if you want a deeper look at how all these pieces fit together, just click the link below. You'll get access to my free training where I walk you through our full retirement optimization framework step by step. And while you're there, you can also download my Modern Guardrails Guide to Smart Retirement Spending. It's a simple, practical breakdown of how to set your spending guardrails so you can have confident, flexible, and on-track spending throughout retirement without constantly worrying about overspending or underspending. So be sure to check that out. All right, let's get back to the video. Let's shift to something that becomes surprisingly important once your own spending needs are fully secured. So once you reach that $2.5 million range, or again, whatever number feels right for your lifestyle, you tend to cross a line where personal spending stops being your primary concern. And when that happens, something interesting rises to the top. Legacy planning becomes the new priority. Now, at this wealth level, efficient wealth transfer to your children or to their heirs, it starts becoming a central part of the conversation. It's no longer just, do we have enough for us? It becomes, how do we pass this on the most meaningfully to somebody else, or the most tax efficient way? And this is where estate considerations start to matter. Most accumulation style planning ignores this entirely. But once you've built enough wealth, you're thinking about trusts, titling, beneficiary coordination, lifetime gifts, and how to avoid unnecessary taxation when wealth moves to that next generation. Charitable giving strategies often enter the picture as well, not just because people want to support the causes that they care about, but because charitable planning can also create significant tax benefits if it's structured strategically. Donor-advised funds, appreciated asset donations, qualified charitable distributions, those become real tools. And what's interesting is that many people find this shift more fulfilling than continuing to accumulate for themselves, because legacy planning, if it's done well, it feels purposeful, it feels intentional, and it often brings more satisfaction than just watching another few percentage points compound in an already large portfolio. So that brings up the question, why does legacy planning become so meaningful at this stage? And I think part of it is impact. Strategic giving and thoughtful planning can make a bigger difference than simply increasing your net worth on a spreadsheet. Another one, I think, is family. Most people, they want to support their kids and their grandkids, but they want to do it in a way that they're not creating dependency or entitlement. Legacy goals also provide something that pure accumulation never could: purpose, a direction for your money that aligns with what matters to you. Doing legacy planning, right? It gives people purpose, but there's something else that shifts too, and there's a mindset and emotional shift that they face. And even when someone reaches that level where they get beyond the basic fear of not having enough, the emotional shift, it's not automatic, because there's a psychological transition here. And often it proves harder than financial planning itself. I mean, for decades, you've been in build mode, saving, accumulating, being responsible, and those habits get locked in. So even when the math says you're secure, you can spend, your instinct says, don't touch that, right? Your identity has been shaped around being a good saver and a builder, and shifting into someone who can actually use and enjoy that wealth. I mean, it feels very unfamiliar. Fear of loss also stays strong, sometimes even stronger at higher wealth levels. And that emotional resistance, it can override planning projections that clearly show that, hey, your spending is going to be okay, but the emotions tend to kind of disagree with the math. And this is why the psychological transition can be far more challenging than accumulating the wealth in the first place. So, why does adapting to this new mindset matter so much? Like, why am I harping on it in a couple of different videos? I've said the same message, because wealth doesn't improve your life if you can't bring yourself to use it. I mean, learning how to actually use your money on purpose and in a way that supports your life, it creates a very different retirement than just continuing to save out of habit. And that's what turns financial security into the lifestyle that you've been working towards all these years. So for a lot of people, who reach this place, getting comfortable with that emotional shift, it just becomes just as important as when they were accumulating, right? Or just as important then as adding another tax strategy or another financial tactic. So now that you understand the psychological shifts, let's look at a comprehensive high net worth framework that addresses all of these changes. So once you've crossed that mark, again, whatever it is for your lifestyle, the real value comes from having a framework that pulls all of these pieces together. Because at this stage, the goal isn't just more growth. Again, it's about getting more out of the wealth that you have. And that usually starts with shifting from a growth first mindset to a tax optimization mindset. For many high net worth families, that single shift can increase your after-tax wealth by 20 to 30% over the course of retirement. It's not just about beating the market, it's about keeping more of what your portfolio is already producing. Control strategies, they really sit right at the center of that, using Roth conversions intentionally, taking strategic distributions during low income years, and shrinking future RMDs before they become a problem, right? All of that reduces your lifetime tax burden in a way that accumulation strategies simply can't. So then after that, you layer in a legacy plan or legacy planning, and this is where you build purpose into your finances. You're structuring your gifts, you're planning for your heirs, you're supporting causes that you care about, and you're doing it in ways that are tax efficient and they're aligned with your values. And none of this works well unless you also address the psychological side of retirement, the shift from building money to actually using it. Because once that emotional piece clicks, you can deploy your resources with confidence instead of hesitation. So what makes this framework work so well? I think a big part of it is using and working with advisors who are truly tax focused, not just investment focused. Because once your wealth reaches this level, tax decisions, they really drive more of your long-term results than your investment selection. It also requires annual strategy reviews. Life changes, tax laws shift, your goals evolve, and your plan needs to adapt right along with them. And the planning itself, it has to be comprehensive, not just investments, not just taxes, not just estate planning, but the full spectrum, financial, tax, legacy, and psychological, all working together in one coordinated approach. And when you implement it properly, this kind of planning, it can possibly increase your lifetime after-tax wealth by $500,000 to $1 million or more compared to just continuing the accumulation strategies that got you here. So now that you see how everything changes once you reach this level of savings and why taxes, control, legacy, and your mindset matter more than just a pure accumulation mindset, you can start to adjust your plan and get the most out of what you've built. And if you need more help with your retirement plan, click the link below. You can watch our free training where we show you how we help people to retire with confidence and clarity. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.